My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "This house is perfect for my mom." She forgot one important detail. She stood in the kitchen my husband built with his own 2 hands, ran her fingers across my counter like she was already pricing it for the estate sale, smiled the sweetest smile I have ever seen on a grown woman, and said, "Mary, this house is perfect for my mom." She had no idea that 6 weeks later, that one sentence would cost her everything, because she never once thought to ask whose name was actually on the deed. If this is your first time here, my name is Mary, I'm 68 years old, and I don't do this for views. I do this because somebody out there is sitting in a house that's rightfully theirs, being made to feel small by people who think old age means stupid. So before I go any further, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let me tell you what happened in my house. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what I did. I wasn't always the woman who fights back. For most of my life, I was the woman who kept the peace. I raised 1 son, buried 1 husband, and spent 31 years teaching 2nd grade in a school that doesn't even exist anymore because they tore it down for condos. I know how to be quiet. I know how to swallow things. That's what made what happened next so easy for them to try, and so satisfying for me to end. My husband's name was Edward. We built our house together in 1987, out on Larkspur Lane, a modest 3-bedroom with a wraparound porch he was prouder of than any car he ever owned. We paid it off in 18 years by skipping vacations and driving the same Buick until the floor rusted through. That house wasn't fancy, but it was ours, every board and every nail. Earned in cash and time and love. Edward passed 6 years ago, heart attack in the garage while he was fixing the lawnmower. I found him with a wrench still in his hand. I tell you that because I want you to understand what that house meant to me. It wasn't just a house. It was the last room he ever stood in. My son's name is Kevin. He married a woman named Jessica about 9 years ago, and for the first few years I liked her. She brought me flowers on my birthday. She called me mom without me ever asking her to. I thought I'd gotten lucky. Then Jessica's mother, a woman named Linda, lost her apartment when the building she rented in got sold to developers. And suddenly, my son and his wife started visiting more. Suddenly, Jessica started asking questions that sounded innocent but weren't. "Mary, don't you think this house is a lot for just one person? Mary, wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller? Somewhere with less to clean? Mary, have you ever thought about assisted living just to see what it's like?" I answered every question honestly because I still believed at that point that they were asking out of love. I told them I was fine. I told them Edward's house was the only place I still felt like myself. I told them I had no intention of leaving until they carried me out feet first, and I meant it as a joke, and Jessica laughed, but her laugh had an edge to it I didn't understand yet. Then one Sunday in March, Jessica came over for what she called a visit, and Kevin didn't come with her. That should have told me something right there. She walked through my house like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been in it 100 times before. She ran her hand along my kitchen counter, the counter Edward had tiled himself over a long weekend, cursing the whole time because the tiles kept slipping before the grout set. And then she smiled at me, that bright, practiced smile, and she said, "Mary, this house is perfect for my mom." I remember the silence that followed. I remember the sound of my own refrigerator humming. I remember thinking, surely I misheard her. But she kept talking, filling the silence with reasons, like she'd rehearsed them in the car. Linda needed stability. Linda was family too, in a way. I had so much space I wasn't using. It would be temporary just until Linda got back on her feet, and then, well, we'd figure it out from there. She never once asked me how I felt about it. She never once asked if I wanted to leave the last place my husband had lived and died in. She stood in my kitchen and she planned my eviction like she was rearranging furniture. I didn't yell. I didn't cry, not in front of her. I just said, "That's an interesting thought, Jessica," and I offered her coffee, and she left an hour later thinking, I'm sure, that the seed had been planted and would grow on its own. What she didn't know was that the seed she planted had landed on concrete, and concrete has a way of cracking things that fall on it too hard. Here's the important detail Jessica forgot, the one I mentioned at the very beginning. When Edward and I built that house, we didn't just put both our names on the deed like most young couples do. Edward's father had been swindled out of his own home decades earlier by a business partner who convinced him to add his name to the title for tax purposes, and it had haunted my father-in-law for the rest of his life. So Edward, cautious to the bone, insisted we set our house up differently. We put the property into a living trust, one that named me as the sole trustee and sole beneficiary for as long as I was alive. Kevin was named as the beneficiary only after my death, and only if certain conditions were met. Kevin knew about the trust in a general sense. He'd been told years ago that the house would come to him eventually, but he had never actually read the document, not the fine print, and neither had Jessica. They assumed, the way people often assume about aging parents, that the details didn't matter because I was old and pliable and wouldn't fight for myself. What they didn't know was that the trust gave me, and only me, complete legal authority over that property until the day I died. Not Kevin. Not Jessica. Not a single soul on this earth could remove me from that house, sell it out from under me, or install someone else in it, without my written consent. I could live there until I was 110, and there wasn't a court in this country that could touch it. So when Jessica smiled at me and said this house was perfect for her mother, she wasn't just being presumptuous. She was planning to move another woman into a home she had absolutely no legal claim to, based on nothing but the assumption that I was too old, too tired, or too polite to say no. I decided right there over that pot of coffee she barely touched, that I wasn't going to say no right away. I was going to let her keep planning. I was going to let her keep smiling, because I wanted to see exactly how far they intended to take this before I brought the whole thing down around them. Over the next several weeks, I played the part they expected of me. I let Jessica bring her mother by just to see the neighborhood, which turned into Linda measuring my bedroom windows for curtains she apparently already had in storage. I let Kevin sit at my kitchen table and talk about how things could work if I moved into what he called a cute little senior community 20 minutes away, one he'd clearly already toured without me. I nodded. I asked polite questions. I let them believe the old woman was coming around. Inside, I was doing something else entirely. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Angela who had handled Edward's estate and knew the trust inside and out. I asked her to confirm in plain language exactly what my rights were. She actually laughed, when I told her what Jessica had said in my kitchen. Mary, she told me, they could plan a coronation in that living room and it wouldn't matter. You are the only person on this earth who can decide who lives in that house. Full stop. That was the confirmation I needed. But I didn't want to just tell them no and watch them slink away, quietly furious, ready to try again in a year with a different approach. I wanted them to understand completely and permanently that this was never going to happen, and I wanted them to understand it in a way that would embarrass them out of ever trying it again. So I set a trap. I told Kevin and Jessica that I'd been thinking hard about their offer, and that I wanted to have a family dinner to discuss next steps. I told them to bring Linda. I said I wanted us all to sit down together like adults and talk about what a transition might look like. Jessica was so pleased with herself I could hear it in her voice over the phone. She told me she was so proud of me for being open-minded. I nearly dropped the phone right there in my own kitchen. What none of them knew was that I had also invited 2 other people to that dinner. My attorney, Angela, and my late husband's younger brother, a retired police detective named Howard, who had never much cared for Kevin's tendency to take the easy road in life and who, frankly, had been waiting years for an excuse to put my son in his place. They arrived on a Friday evening, Kevin and Jessica and Linda, all dressed a little nicer than usual, like they were coming to celebrate something. Linda even brought a small houseplant for the new place, she said cheerfully, setting it on my counter like she already owned it. I let them get comfortable. I served the roast I'd made, I poured the wine, I let the conversation drift toward pleasantries, the weather, Linda's grandchildren from her other daughter, Kevin's job. And then right as the plates were being cleared, the doorbell rang and I asked Kevin to get it. He opened the door to find Angela standing there with a leather folder under her arm, and right behind her Howard, still built like the cop he used to be, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching. The color drained out of Jessica's face the second she understood this wasn't a casual family dinner. Kevin looked between his uncle and the lawyer and back at me like he was trying to solve a math problem he hadn't studied for. I stood up at the head of my own table in my own house, and I said I wanted us all here together because I think it's important that everyone understands exactly how this house works before anyone measures another window for curtains. Angela opened her folder and in calm, plain, unshakable language, explained the trust. She explained that I was the sole trustee. She explained that the property could not be sold, transferred, rented, or otherwise reassigned to any party, including Linda, without my written and notarized consent, and that any attempt to pressure, coerce, or manipulate a trustee into transferring property against her wishes could, depending on circumstances, constitute elder financial abuse under state law. I watched that last sentence land on Jessica like a physical blow. Elder financial abuse. Not a phrase you want attached to your name, especially not when your husband's mother is the one saying it out loud in front of a retired detective who spent 30 years investigating exactly that kind of thing. Howard didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just asked one quiet question, directed at Linda, who by then looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Did you know, ma'am, that no one in this room had the legal right to offer you this house? Linda said no. In fact, Linda looked genuinely stunned, and I believed her. I don't think Linda was the architect of this. I think Linda was simply a woman without a home who trusted her daughter's assurances, the same way I once trusted my own son's assurances that everything he and Jessica did was in my best interest. Jessica, on the other hand, had no such excuse. Jessica had walked through my kitchen and smiled and made plans, and Jessica now sat at my table with nothing to say, because there was nothing she could say that wouldn't make things worse. I let the silence sit for a moment before I spoke again, because I wanted every word to land clean. I told them that Edward built this house with his own hands, and that he died in it, and that as long as I drew breath, no one, not Kevin, not Jessica, not Linda, not a single living soul, was going to move me out of it to make room for someone else's comfort. I told Jessica that I understood her mother needed help, and that I even had sympathy for Linda's situation because I know what it feels like to lose the roof over your head in a different way when Edward died and the house suddenly felt too big and too quiet to bear. But I told her that sympathy for one person does not give you the right to plan the removal of another person from her own home, especially not behind her back, especially not while smiling at her in her own kitchen like she was already halfway out the door. I told Kevin, my son, the boy I raised alone through most weeknights while Edward worked overtime, that I was disappointed, not because he wanted to help his wife's family, but because he'd let it happen without ever once asking me what I wanted. I told him that somewhere along the way, he'd started seeing me as an obstacle to be managed instead of a mother to be respected, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between a son and a stranger. Nobody argued. There was nothing left to argue with. Angela's folder sat open on the table with the truth spelled out in black and white. Howard's presence made clear that this wasn't a matter I intended to handle quietly if it ever happened again, and my own words had made it clear that the sweet, agreeable mother-in-law they thought they could steer had teeth after all. Linda left that night and, to her credit, called me a week later to apologize personally. She told me she'd had no idea the house wasn't simply available, and she thanked me sincerely for not holding it against her. I didn't. I helped her, actually in a different way, by connecting her with a housing assistance program through my church that eventually found her a small, affordable apartment 2 towns over. I didn't do it because I owed her anything. I did it because it costs me nothing to be decent to someone who was, in the end, more misled than malicious. Jessica and Kevin took much longer to speak to me again. There was a stretch of almost 4 months where the calls stopped, where holidays passed without an invitation either direction, where I genuinely didn't know if my relationship with my son would recover. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It did. Even after everything, he's still my boy, and there's a particular kind of grief in watching your own child choose someone else's comfort over your dignity. But something shifted slowly. Kevin called me one evening in the fall alone without Jessica on the line, and he told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he realized somewhere in those months that he'd been so focused on keeping peace in his marriage that he'd stopped asking whether the peace was fair to me. He apologized, really apologized, not the kind of apology that's really an excuse in disguise, but the kind where someone actually sits with what they did wrong. Jessica and I have never fully gone back to how things were, and honestly I don't think we should. Trust, once you watch someone plan around you instead of with you, doesn't simply reset. But she is civil now, respectful now, and she has never again suggested, even once, that my house belongs to anyone but me. I still live on Larkspur Lane. I still make my coffee in the kitchen Edward tiled with his own 2 hands. I still sit on that wraparound porch some evenings and talk to him a little, the way you do when you've loved someone that long, and I tell him what happened, and I like to think wherever he is, he's proud of how his cautious little trust turned out to be the thing that saved his wife's dignity. Part 7. What I want you to take from this. If you're watching this and someone in your life has started talking about your home like it's already theirs to give away, listen to me carefully. Smile back at them if you have to. Not if it keeps the peace for now. But go find your paperwork. Read every line of it. Know exactly what you own and exactly what protection you have, because the people who try this rarely expect the sweet old woman in the kitchen to know her own rights better than they do. I am 68 years old and I am not done. I raised a son, I buried a husband, and I am not about to be smiled out of the last home he ever stood in. Nobody gets to plan your life around their comfort just because they've decided you're too old, too tired, or too polite to say no. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and remember, it is never too late to stand in your own kitchen and say quietly and clearly, "This is still mine."